Have you ever noticed how often we're told to wait? Wait for things to change. Wait for permission. Wait for someone else to fix what's broken. Sometimes that waiting is wrapped in religious language about divine plans or being chosen, but underneath it all is a quieter message. Don't rock the boat. Don't ask too much. And definitely don't act like responsibility belongs to you. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for the baptism of the Lord, we'll explore what these ancient stories say when you strip away supernatural spectacle and focus instead on ethical responsibility, shared standards, and what it really means to live an exemplary life. In this episode, I'm asking an honest question. What if the highest calling isn't obedience or belief? What if the highest calling is showing up, standing in solidarity with others, and modeling the change we keep hoping someone else will bring? So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for the baptism of the Lord, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas. They weren't written as history books or scientific manuals. They were meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for the baptism of the Lord, Cycle A. Our first reading is from Isaiah. It's chapter 42, verses 1 through 4, and verses 6 and 7. Our second reading is from Acts of the Apostles. It's chapter 10, verses 34 through 38. And our gospel reading is from Matthew. It's chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. Now we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from the prophet Isaiah. Thus says the Lord, Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out, or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. Our second reading is from Acts of the Apostles. Peter proceeded to speak to those gathered in the house of Cornelius, saying, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. You know what has happened throughout the province of Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John preached, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. And our gospel reading is from Matthew. Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" Jesus replied, "Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." Then John consented. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from the prophet Isaiah. And when we read this without its later religious overlays, it sounds less like a supernatural prediction and more like a survival strategy. Now, this was believed to have been written during the Babylonian exile, so it speaks to a people who had lost their land, their institutions, and their sense of purpose. Now, the servant here, if you read this in its entirety, the servant is not a lone heroic figure, but more of a collective, an entire community being challenged to respond to humiliation and injustice, not with vengeance or domination, but with ethical clarity. Instead of trying to reclaim greatness through force, the text imagines a different kind of strength, becoming an example others can point to and say, this is what justice and decency look like. That idea feels especially relevant today when many Americans are appalled by the international bullying, the lawlessness, both here and abroad, and the cruelty that's being carried out by this administration in our name. There's also a clear political edge to this reading. This was a poem. This reading was a poem, and this poem emerged at basically a moment of global change. It was during the rise of Cyrus the Great, whose policies absolutely disrupted the usual imperial model by allowing displaced peoples to return home and rebuild their cultures. So against that backdrop, Isaiah's vision subtly rejects the old obsession with kingship, conquest, and raw power. Instead, it elevates service, repair, and restoration as the foundation of a healthy society. And guess what? History backs this up. The most meaningful progress in the United States, whether it was our founding fathers coming together or up into the civil rights movement, labor protections, social safety nets, all of the most meaningful progress we've made hasn't come from domination. It's come from people choosing to serve the common good and choosing to repair harm. This text is urging a reordering of priorities. It's saying that power exists to restore life, not to crush it. So this ethical reorientation becomes clearest in one of probably the most misunderstood lines in this reading. And that's where Isaiah says, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. Now, most people read this with two additional commas in there, implying that the servant is the bruised reed and is the smoldering wick. They'll read it, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. This is not about someone enduring abuse, though. It's not about enduring abuse without being destroyed, as these Christians later claimed. It's about how the vulnerable are treated. A bruised reed is already damaged. The smoldering wick is barely holding on. Justice in this vision does not finish them off. It protects what is fragile and allows it to survive. That's empathy paired with fairness. Measured strength instead of ruthless efficiency. And it raises an uncomfortable question for modern movements that claim biblical authority while showing open contempt for the weak, the poor, the disabled, or the marginalized. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that we must become moral role models. When we look at it holistically, this passage offers a blueprint for rebuilding communities after trauma. It says we need to abandon the pursuit of dominance. We need to protect the vulnerable. And we need to measure success by justice rather than by spectacle or displays of power. If this text is called a prophecy, then it remains woefully unfinished, because too many people are still blind in every sense of the word, and too many remain trapped by systems that crush instead of restore. The work isn't about waiting for a savior. It's about choosing to live differently. And the first step is that we must become moral role models. Our second reading was from Acts of the Apostles. And at its core, this passage dismantles tribal thinking. When Peter says, "There is no partiality," the human meaning is clear. Dignity is not assigned by group membership. Human worth isn't earned. It's not given through ethnicity, nationality, religion, sex, gender, or social status. Human worth is inherent. Now, read this way, this reading from Acts challenges the deeply ingrained instinct to divide the world into us and them. It's an instinct that has justified exclusion, violence, and indifference for centuries or longer. The text quietly but firmly insists that fairness is not selective. If justice only applies to people like us, well, it isn't justice at all. The passage then makes a decisive pivot away from belief and toward behavior. What matters is not what someone claims to believe, but whether they do what is right. From a secular humanist lens, this is a powerful rejection of what I call moral outsourcing. Your ethics can't be validated simply by your religious affiliation or the rituals you practice. Your ethics have to be demonstrated through your actions. Now, this reframing cuts through the empty moral posturing, and it asks a harder question. Do our choices reduce harm? Do they increase trust? Do they contribute to shared well-being? Integrity, in this sense, isn't about doctrinal purity. And it's certainly not about proof-texting the Bible and parroting what your narrow-minded preacher said. Integrity is about aligning your values with how you actually live. Now, the description of Jesus going about doing good, well, that should reinforce this action-centered ethic. Stripped of the supernatural framing, it reads like a simple but demanding model of active altruism. Notice suffering, respond to it, and don't wait for permission. Now, what's just as important, though, is the broader context. Peter was entering the home of Cornelius, someone who is considered an outsider. And if you read all of the context, all the verses surrounding this little selection we read, you'll see that Peter was changed by the encounter. You'll see that moments like this highlight the power of dialogue and the power of curiosity. Progress doesn't come from staying comfortable or maintaining our prejudices. Progress comes from listening, learning, and allowing our assumptions to be challenged by real human connection. Anyway, the main lesson I got from our second reading is that righteousness is found in how we treat one another. Together, these ideas form a grounded moral framework. Reject tribalism, judge ethics by outcomes, and choose action over abstraction. Motivation doesn't need to come from fear of punishment or divine approval. Empathy, reason, shared responsibility, those are more than enough. Those should motivate us. When we understand that harm to others ultimately harms the whole, well, moral clarity becomes a matter of character rather than a matter of compliance with some supernatural doctrine. In the end, righteousness isn't supernatural or exclusive. It's visible, practical, and relational. Righteousness is found in how we treat one another. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of Matthew. And when we peel away all the supernatural imagery in this scene, the opened heavens, the descending dove, the divine voice, what we're left with is a very human moment of choice and commitment. At its core, baptism functions as a public act of alignment. It's a decision to step into a shared moral project. Jesus insisted on participating in a ritual meant for people who are seeking change, growth, and renewal. If you read it humanistically, this is a voluntary submission to a common standard. It's not a claim to special status. It's the recognition that meaningful change doesn't start by placing yourself above everyone else. It comes when you join them in the work. So that insistence, Jesus' insistence on being baptized, it also carries a powerful lesson about leadership. And in this story, Jesus doesn't claim an exemption. He submits to John, who occupies a lower rung in the narrative hierarchy. So this reversal challenges the idea that leaders are entitled to different rules or looser accountability. Ethical leadership demands humility, living by the same expectations that you place on others. This is precisely the lesson that too many religious institutions have failed to learn, especially when leaders protect one another from consequences rather than protecting the people who were harmed. Look, integrity collapses the moment hierarchy becomes a shield for accountability. Now, this scene also highlights the human need for symbolic milestones. This moment marks a transition for Jesus from private life to public responsibility, from inward formation to outward action. And water is a universal symbol of renewal. We don't need to see it as some magical cleansing, but as a conscious decision to begin again with clarity of purpose. The so-called voice from heaven, that can be understood as something far more relatable. It can be the inner conviction, and often the communal affirmation that comes when a person's actions finally align with their deepest values. So righteousness here isn't perfection. It's an alignment between belief, identity, and behavior. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that true leadership begins with solidarity and ethical integrity, not exemption or superiority. Stripped of all its mythological trappings, this passage offers a demanding ethical vision. This gospel passage rejects elitism. It calls leaders to live by the same standards as everyone else, and it frames justice as lived integrity rather than proclaimed superiority. The defining moment is not the divine approval. The defining moment in this story is Jesus' refusal to stand apart from the human condition. In a world where political and economic elites increasingly act as though laws and morals don't apply to them, this story exposes the emptiness of exceptionalism. Real leadership shows up, stands alongside others, and does the work openly and honestly. True leadership begins with solidarity and ethical integrity, not with exemption or superiority. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Isaiah, the main lesson I came away with was we must become moral role models. In our second reading from Acts, the main lesson I got was righteousness is found in how we treat one another. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was true leadership begins with solidarity and ethical integrity, not with exemption or superiority. Taken together, these readings sketch out what an exemplary life actually looks like. And it's not passive, it's not pious, it's not dependent on divine rescue from above. Again and again, the emphasis in these readings is on showing up, choosing service instead of dominance, choosing action instead of memes, and shared standards instead of special exemptions. The servant isn't someone waiting for permission or for divine intervention. The servant is someone who accepts responsibility for the well-being of others and then acts accordingly. That means refusing to stand apart from human struggle. It means rejecting tribal shortcuts that allow us to excuse cruelty. And it means understanding that leadership is proven by example. It's not about status. An exemplary life is lived in full view of others. It's a life that is grounded in integrity and fairness and empathy. You can tell people who are trying to live an exemplary life because they're not tearing shit down. They've got the courage to step into the work of repairing what's broken and building something better. If we're serious about wanting a more just, humane world, the call is clear. We need to stop waiting for someone else to fix it. We need to start living like the role model we've been hoping for. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall. See if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what and now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care because the sheer volume of harm being done right now is almost overwhelming. There is so much bad shit happening. Authoritarianism, cruelty dressed up as morality, lies moving far faster than the truth. It's easy to feel paralyzed. These readings push back on that paralysis. They remind us that you don't have to be on the front lines to matter. Supporting people who are doing the work, well, that counts. Making the call, sending the emails, saying thank you when an elected official does the right thing, but being clear about expectations when they don't. An exemplary life doesn't require heroics. It requires participation. This is important because everyday conversations are part of the work, whether we like it or not. Misinformation doesn't spread because everyone believes it deeply. It spreads because too many people just let it slide. Living an exemplary life means caring enough to gently push back, to ask questions, to say, that doesn't sit right with me, or that doesn't sound quite right, especially with friends and family. I know these moments are uncomfortable, but they're also where integrity shows up. This isn't about winning arguments. It's about refusing to let cruelty and dishonesty pass as normal. We should care about this because domination is not the same thing as building something. A lot of modern Christianity, especially Christian nationalism, is obsessed with control. But they do that by tearing down institutions, condemning outsiders, and demanding compliance through fear. But what does that actually create? Not community, not trust, not flourishing. The fixation on ruling everything isn't about shared values. It's all about exclusion. And that's a dead giveaway that the loudest voices claiming moral authority have drifted far from the human-centered values that allowed societies to function in the first place. This is important because feelings alone won't change a damn thing. Anger, fear, and anxiety, look, those are all understandable, but they're not strategies. Hell, they're not even tactics. These readings insist that responsibility doesn't stop at awareness, doesn't stop at your emotions. If we want a more humane world, action has to follow conviction. Exemplary lives are lived out loud in small, steady choices that repair rather than destroy. If we keep waiting for someone else to fix what's broken, we're just outsourcing responsibility. The real question is whether we're willing to live like the role models we keep wishing would show up. And the last question I'll answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Where do we go from here? Well, when the world feels heavy and chaotic, look, it's easy to slip into spectator mode. Watching, reacting, worrying, getting furious, and waiting for someone else to step up. But meaningful change rarely comes from grand gestures or perfect plans. It comes from ordinary people making intentional choices in the spaces they already occupy. Their relationships, their workplaces, their communities. An exemplary life isn't about doing everything. It's about doing something on purpose, with clarity and with integrity. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. Where in my everyday life am I being called to move from passive concern to responsible action? And what is one concrete step I can take this week to live a more exemplary life? Right? It's about looking at your life and saying, where am I being passive? And where should, a place where I'm being passive but should take action instead? And what's just one concrete step I can take this week to live a more exemplary life? This question, it matters because it forces us to be honest with ourselves. It can help you move past vague frustration, and it can help you identify a specific place where your values can show up through actions. When you name that place, whether it's a conversation you've been avoiding, support you could offer, or maybe a boundary you need to set. When you do that, you turn abstract ideals into practical direction. Several years ago, when I was still active in parish ministry, I was helping teach the RCIA program. It's the process that adults go through when they're preparing to join the Catholic Church. Early on, one of the volunteer instructors, he kept hijacking the class. Seriously, anytime the conversation touched on community, shared responsibility, or care for the vulnerable, he'd jump in and do things like, insisting that, Jesus was not a socialist. Right? He talked about socialism and communism being inherently evil, and that capitalism had been the only good economic system since the beginning of civilization, since the dawn of time. He did this repeatedly, even after one of the Franciscan friars pushed back and tried to get him to quiet down. He kept trying to turn formation sessions into ideological arguments. After the third class that he disrupted in this way, I finally confronted him. It was after the attendees had left, so it wasn't a public confrontation. He'd been praising capitalism again. So I pointed out, calmly, that modern capitalism is only a few hundred years old, with roots in merchant capitalism from the Islamic world and medieval Europe, so maybe an argument could be made that it was a couple hundred years older than that. And he exploded. That's ridiculous. The Mesopotamians, they had money 3,000 years ago. That's when it became clear that we weren't necessarily disagreeing, because we weren't even talking about the same thing. I explained to him that, look, money is a tool. It's a medium of exchange of value, while capitalism is a specific economic system, and it's built around private ownership and things like investment for profit. Now, currency, right, money, that predates capitalism by thousands of years. Sure, capitalism uses money, but money doesn't define capitalism. Now, he refused to acknowledge the distinction, because doing so would have unraveled a lot of his claims. He also refused to wrestle with the contradictions in his own religious practice. I pointed out that receiving communion is an act of communal identity and solidarity. I pointed out that the Bible condemns charging interest as usury, and interest is critical for capitalism. That the forgiveness commanded every 7 years in the Bible, well, that was about releasing people from debts. It wasn't about absolving them of their sins. And none of that fit neatly into his worldview, so none of it was allowed in. He stopped coming after that conversation. Now, that wasn't my goal, but in the end, it was better for the people who were actually there to learn, grow, and think critically. And it stuck with me because it was a reminder that living with integrity sometimes means having uncomfortable conversations, correcting misinformation, and choosing the health of a community over keeping the peace at all costs. That's what responsibility looks like in real life. Not waiting, not posturing, but showing up honestly and doing the work, even the hard work. So spend some time thinking about where in your everyday life, where you're being called to move from passive concern to responsible action. And then identify one concrete step you can take this week to live a more exemplary life. Answering this question builds confidence, not because it solves everything, but because it reminds you that you are not powerless. Over time, these small intentional actions strengthen your sense of agency. They deepen your integrity and align your daily life with the kind of world you actually want to help create. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. American writer and civil rights activist James Baldwin once wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Now, this quote matters for our discussion tonight because it cuts straight through the temptation to stay passive while convincing ourselves that we're just being realistic. Baldwin isn't offering optimism or comfort. He's simply naming responsibility. Facing something doesn't guarantee success, but refusing to face it guarantees stagnation. That idea lines up perfectly with this week's question, which isn't asking you to fix the world. It's just asking you to notice where you've been holding back and then figure out one way to make a different choice. What Baldwin points us toward is the moment before action, the moment of honesty. Facing something might mean acknowledging a conversation you've avoided, or a habit you've rationalized, or a situation where silence just felt easier than integrity. That moment is uncomfortable, but that moment is also where agency begins. Now, the gospel story we read showed Jesus confronting something that most Christians today are actually striving for. He refused to be offered an exception, and he insisted on being treated just like everyone else. You see, every situation we should confront isn't necessarily something that is harming us. In fact, sometimes the most difficult things to face are the ones that offer us an unfair advantage. Regardless of what it is, once you face it, small actions become possible. And those small, deliberate actions are how exemplary lives are actually lived. Not through grand gestures, but through repeated choices to stop looking away, to stop accepting unfair situations, and to start showing up. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week. But in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for the Baptism of the Lord, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that we need to stop waiting for someone else to fix it. We need to start living like the role model we've been hoping for. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible New International Version, NIV, copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, 2011 by Biblica Inc., used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you again for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.